the ungodly and the wicked that really goes again with Revelation, and some of what we see is described about the enemies of God's people and what's happening there. So always coincides well. All right, so we're going to get going on Revelation again here. Last week we ended talking about chapter 12, and rather than reading it again, I'm going to just give a quick summary because I want to get kind of move our timeline along here and see if we can get Revelation. We're more than halfway through, but we're still a good ways away from the end, and I think Jimmy's probably chomping at the bit to get back up here and start teaching. So I got to try to push us along through, but that's probably not going to happen anyway, but we'll try to move as quick as we can. But Revelation 12, what we saw and what we discussed last week is that this is after the seventh trumpet is blown, and we talked about how that really is the end of the judgment against Rome. Now, and it's not done being described. We're going to have a lot more description of what's happening here as we go through the book. But the seventh trumpet contains the seven bowls of wrath, and that's the end of the judgment. So really, I was kind of comparing this to a story you might see in a television show or a book where, you know, you get to the end. You could do it either way. You could either say it's like one where you watch a scene at the beginning of a hour-long television show, and then it goes to commercial break, and when it comes back, it says 12 hours earlier. Like it's going to go back and fill in the gaps. Well, that happens a lot here in Revelation, where we go back and we fill in the gaps. Or you could also say that it's where you get to the end, and then it's going to go back and fill in the gaps. So you actually, the scene that I was talking about before is kind of like a scene in the middle of the story, where so it does both. It kind of goes back and forth. But so at the end of 11, really the entire story has been laid out there, just not in detail yet. So in chapter 12, we get these three symbols that we talked about last week, and that is the woman. And if you look at your Bible, the subheading or the heading says the woman Israel, and I kind of said why I don't agree with that. I don't think that the woman is just Israel, but you can see why somebody might think that, because what is the woman? Well, the woman's about to give birth, and what's she going to give birth to? We talked about that. What is that child that she's going to give birth to? And that, of course, is the Christ, and I agree with that. Most everybody agrees that that's the case. And then you also have the dragon. So you have the woman, she's about to give birth, and the dragon's waiting to devour the child. And then the woman flees into the wilderness. Well, there's a lot of we won't go back through the whole thing, but there's a lot of discussion about the war that wages in heaven, and then Satan being thrown to the earth, the dragon, and then the dragon persecuting the woman, and the earth helping the woman. And so that's where we were at. We were talking about these three symbols: the dragon, the woman, and the child. And we said that most everybody seems to agree that, for the most part, like maybe 85% on what these symbols represent, that it represents God's people, the Christ, Jesus, and then the devil. Where they get into a little bit of debate is over whether the woman represents just Israel, or whether she just represents the church, or what. And I said that we think that I think that she represents God's people across all time. So that would be Israel under the old law and Christians under the new law. And why do we say that? Well, because she's going to give birth to the Christ, so clearly Israel's involved here. But then also she's persecuted after giving birth to the Christ, right? So that would indicate across all time. So that's pretty much where we had gotten. And I was just asking, as we ended last week, okay, so we summarized the main symbols. So what does this vision indicate? And it might be a little hard for you to answer that since we didn't go back and read it. But what does it bring to mind as you read chapter 12, and it talks about the war and Satan being thrown down, or the battle and Satan being thrown down, and then the struggle between the woman and the dragon, as the dragon makes, like verse 17 says, and the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So what does this chapter, this particular vision, what does it indicate? What does it make you think of? And remember, that's what we always got to keep thinking. What does this represent? What does it make you think of? Anybody want to throw anything out there for this chapter before I once again give my opinion? What I think? What it makes me think of?
Sounds to me like a classic example of spiritual warfare.
Spiritual warfare, yeah. I mean, that's what you're dealing with here. And so the point being that it's not a particular event, in my opinion. Like, it's not something where you're just seeing, like, there are prophecies in Revelation, but as you read through Revelation, I don't think you have to look at everything and be like, well, what was this predicting? What was it? It's a depiction of the struggle between good and evil, and God and the devil. I think that's definitely true. I think one thing that it does is it shows that the devil's already defeated. That seems to be the main emphasis to me. The battle scene in heaven says that not says that, but the devil gets thrown out of heaven. Then the voice that speaks in heaven about the salvation of God's people, telling about the salvation that they have, and then the statement that the devil only has a short time. Now then, here's a key part of that, because this is something that's very tempting as you start talking about this. What is that short time? So I just said that I think this is more representative not of a particular event, but of the battle between good and evil. But at the same time, you got to keep it back in context. And what has been my premise from the beginning is that the book of Revelation is, emphasized that these things are to happen shortly and over a fairly short period of time. I mean, we don't know exactly what that period of time is, but it definitely doesn't indicate a long period of time. It says they're to happen quickly, right? So with those two things in mind, there's parts of this book that are very tempting, or of the Revelation, that are very tempting to say, well, that has to be talking about the end time or this or that, and you go down that road. Does it have reference to those things? I think so. But I think it always comes back to the situation at hand between Rome and the church. That's what I think it always comes back to that. So here, when it says, what is the short, when it says that the devil only has a short time for what? Well, I would say that the devil only has a short time to use Rome to attack the church. Now then, once again, whenever you get into the two different authors that I've been reading a lot of, and Hines and McGuigan, Hines doesn't tend to think that it's that short of a time. He goes all the way up through the Reformation period, which to me would not be a short time. That's a long period of time. So I don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, but he does have a lot of things that he says along the way that make sense with that. And that's why we keep coming back to, why was the book of Revelation written the way it was? Well, because it does apply. It applied to that specific situation, but it applies in general to us and to all Christians throughout all time till the end of the world. So that's kind of what I think of with that. And of course, I think it discusses how the devil was going to use Rome to attack the church for a time. We'll see that more as we talk about the next chapter. So this is illustrated by the dragon waiting to devour the woman's child, and then the dragon being thrown down to earth and persecuting the woman that gave birth. The time it can persecute the woman's offspring is limited. We talked about how the symbols show that. And how the woman flees into the wilderness and is nourished for 1,260 days. And then again, in verse 14, when the woman is given eagle's wings and carried into the wilderness to be nourished for a time, times and a half a time. Once again, same representation for a period of time. And then we get the 42 months and the 3.5, that's mentioned a lot throughout this chapter. So all these things are happening for periods of time. They're not a permanent situation. So, as I just mentioned, my opinion is that this particular vision and these symbols are not necessarily representative of specific things to come, even though they relate to things to come. I see this part of Revelation as emphasizing the spiritual war, like what Jimmy said, between the devil and God. And in this case, it's especially showing how the devil's going to use Rome to persecute God's people, but that God's people will be victorious. For a more, from a more eternal perspective, which like I said, I keep going back and forth. You get this what's the eternal perspective, it shows that God's already defeated the devil and that God's people will always have to deal with persecution while here. And that it will come from different sources, but those faithful to God are going to be victorious because the battle's already been won. So that's kind of my summary and take on chapter 12. Anybody have any comments or anything else before we go on to chapter 13? All right. If not, one of you guys want to read 13, 1 through 10?
And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore, and I saw the beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if he had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave great authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" And there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth as a blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, whose dwell in heaven. And it was given to him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them in authority, and over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given him. And to dwell on the earth was worship him, and everyone whose name had not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone who has destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword, and the sword he must be killed. There is preference in faith in the saints.
All right. So, chapter 13 is an interesting chapter, I think, and this is where you get a lot of the futurist view, looking for the Antichrist and the beast and the mark of the beast and 666 and all that sort of stuff. And we've already discussed this chapter pretty much in full because we covered the beasts and what the beasts are. So rather than trying to I'm going to try to cover this pretty quickly since we've already covered these symbols. And when I say that, of course, we'll probably end up taking the rest of the class to do it. But I also have down here that I want to ask a few questions to jog your memories. So that's horrible typing on my part because it's supposed to be jog your memories, right? To remind you of what we talked about. So, okay, so first off, the 13, 1 through 10 talk about the beast from the sea. So let's cover just a couple of questions here. What does the sea represent? Do you remember in Revelation, what does the sea usually represent? Of course, there's different types of seas, but what would the sea represent in this case? Because he's coming up out of the sea, right? So what does the sea represent? Well, usually the sea represents happenings in the world, right? So you're talking about nations and people that are troubled or disturbed. So there's a lot going on at this period of time. Unrest, you might say. The beast, like the dragon, has 7 heads and 10 horns. Anybody remember what the heads might represent? 7 heads.
City of Rome.
Right, the Rome. Yeah, remember that slide that we put up with the hills? Now, why is that? Well, a lot of people come here and just try to interpret this chapter in a vacuum, but we don't need to because we're actually, if you go back to chapter 17 and verses 7 through 10, it says, "And the angel said to me, 'Why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman.'" And of course, in this case, there's a woman riding on a beast. I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast, that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. So the woman sits on 7 mountains. And everybody knew what that meant, right? It wasn't a, well, I wonder what he's talking about there. 7 mountains, Rome, 7 hills. So we know that they, what they represent. What do the horns represent? Once again, you can go to chapter 17. I won't read any more out of 17, but you can go to 17 and see that they are diadems, and they represent Rome's allies that give power to the beast. So once again, a little bit of history there, which I won't get into, but as Rome conquered the world, the allies gave power to Rome and did business with Rome. Why is the beast described with characteristics of a leopard, a bear, and a lion? We talked about that, if you remember. You remember the vision that was given to Daniel in Daniel chapter 7? I think we put that up on the board as well. The animals are used in Daniel 7 to represent the empires of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. And so then this image rolls them all into one to represent the power of Rome, right? What does the head that had a fatal wound and that was slain represent? Anybody remember that? Probably not. Maybe. I don't know that we know for sure exactly on this one. Hines indicates that it's sufficient to know that Rome was a pagan empire, and that a head receiving a death stroke means that that particular form of paganism was to be harmed or had been dealt with. He relates this to the invasions of the Goths from the year 409 to 476. And like I said, he puts these things in a much later time frame than what I would normally think of, because I think really the end of Rome would be considered 476 when Rome fell, as opposed to going all the way out through the Reformation period. But that's just to let you know what he thinks of it. Certainly, I think it makes sense that it has to do with pagan Rome, but the time period there, I think, is a little late as far as what he's talking about. Now, McGuigan relates it to a particular emperor of Rome. He believes it to be Nero. He says that the beast was dead when Nero died. So if you remember, Nero was a cruel emperor. Jimmy talks a lot about how the stuff that Nero did. So Nero was really cruel. So he's saying that when Nero died, this part of the beast was killed, but it's going to come back up, right? So McGuigan actually goes through a comparison of Daniel to Revelation and lays out exactly which emperors he believes are being discussed here and in chapter 17. I'm not going to go into that. To me, that's complicated, and I don't ever remember it. And all you guys are going to look at me if I ask that question and say, yeah, we don't remember who we're talking about. But he goes through and tries to relate this, like, here's your 1 through 7 and 8, and all going down through all the numbers. So I don't know if the slain head is referring to Nero or a different, something related to the pagan religion or a different emperor. Some of you may have opinions on that. Some of you may not. But what we do know is that things, like what we've discussed already, things are going to go back and forth between Rome being supportive of Christianity and persecuting Christianity, right? We had good emperors and bad emperors, and it's going to go back and forth. So to me, that's what this is giving indication of, is that, the emperors are part of the beast, and that things are going to go back and forth. Who dwells on the earth? in this vision? Unbelievers are on the earth. Who dwells in heaven? Believers. So, but both groups are physically in Rome. We talked a lot about sometimes when the earth is used, or the in these visions, it's representative of Rome, just the empire of Rome. And this is why I think you get into some of the translations where people are like, Christians are going to be taken out of the world and live in heaven while people are still going to remain here on earth, and all of those kind of things. But it's really just representative of the two different groups of people. And we see that being emphasized over and over again through these visions, the separation of God's people from those who aren't God's people, the wicked and the ungodly. So why does the beast blaspheme for 42 months? We've talked a lot about 42 months, 3.5 years. What does that represent? What does that mean in this vision? I think it indicates that the power that the beast has is not going to last forever. It's limited. Rome's not going to last forever. We know that, and its time is limited to be used as a piece to persecute the Christians. All right, then what did it mean that someone's name was not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world? That's an interesting verse, right? Does that mean that God's preordained and what's going to happen, and we don't have a choice in our lives? I don't think so. I think it means that God knows. We've talked about it, and this is very complicated, and it's hard to wrap your brain around because we exist in time, right? We exist in a linear time. Time goes from here, and it keeps going. And there's no way that we can know the future, and there's no way we can go back into the past. We live in the present. But God exists outside of time. So God knows those who are going to obey him and those who aren't. That doesn't mean that he's not giving them the choice. It just means that he knows it. It's hard for us to comprehend, but I don't think God there's no indication that God takes free will from a statement like that. That he doesn't give free will to everybody. It just means that he knows.
That reminds me of 2 Peter 1, where Peter says God knows how to hold those under until the day of judgment. He's like keeping them at bay. I almost get the feeling like, especially in relation to Revelation 13, where Satan's able to kind of disseminate his power to other people and other angels. And, like if you juxtapose Revelation 13 with 2 Peter 1, you're like, God's been holding these evil people and evil angels at bay for a really long time. Like, it's not anything new for Peter. It's
right.
Not like a surprise. He's like, that God has the power to do that.
I think it goes back to, when God created the world, what was the purpose in creating the world? It was and we come simple. That could be a long discussion, and we had a long discussion about it when we went through Job. But I mean, the simplest way I could put it is, he wanted to create a world where he allowed enough choice for us to be able to choose, like where he's not overwhelming us and saying, you have to be my servant, you have to accept me, while at the same time not being so distant that it's impossible to find him. Or to meet him. So the world was created in a way that gives us that opportunity, which is why, once again, good and evil, evil and suffering exist, because God gave us the choice. And so once we had that choice, that was going to happen. Evil was going to come in, and then suffering is going to come in. That's going to happen if we're given the choice. So like I said, that could be a very long discussion, and we can get into a lot of stuff there. But basically, I think that goes right down that line. Like he's allowing the devil to have enough power to cause trouble, but not to overwhelm. not to, the victory is God's at the end of the day. So I don't think that there's an indication of God taking away free will. I think it's just that he knows. It's a statement of God knowing. Also, when you talk about predestined, he's talking about he set this up for us. He set up the way for us to be saved from the get-go. Like he knew what was going to happen. He knew that Jesus was going to have to come and die on the cross for us. So he knew that. Also then in verses 9 and 10, where it talks about if anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. I don't think that statement is meant to express defeat, but it's to explain how God's people are to view life, to view the events. Those that kill with the sword will be killed with the sword. I think that, you go back to Matthew 26:52, Jesus says something along those lines there. Also, Paul says we reap what we sow in Galatians 6:7. So I think it's not saying, obviously anybody who's killed somebody with a sword is not going to necessarily get killed by the sword. It's more of a statement of the way life is, those kind of things. All right, so finally, just to wrap up that section, what does the beast from the sea represent? And like I said, we already talked about that, but let's just make sure that we're on the same page here. The beast is Rome, right? We talked about that, the 7 hills. So we said that it represents political and military Rome. So the devil is going to use the Roman Empire as a tool to harm the church. All right. Let's go ahead and do, if one of you guys wants to read Romans 13:11 through 18 then. And this is the beast from the earth.
Revelations 11.
13:11.
Yeah.
13:11 through 18.
The beast from earth, from the earth. Then I saw another beast coming up from the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from the heaven to the earth in the presence of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of all the signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many to do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And it causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell or expect the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. He is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number of that man, and the number is 666.
Okay, so once again, we've covered this one when we talked about the symbols back a few weeks ago. But this section describes the second beast coming up out of the earth. So why does the beast come up out of the earth? Once again, symbolism, what does this represent?
Mankind as a whole.
Sort of. I think it means that it's of human origin. Yeah. It doesn't descend out of heaven. It doesn't come out of heaven. Doesn't come out of the clouds. It's coming up out of the earth. We also talked about how earth sometimes could be used to talk about Rome in these revelations, right? So it could be coming up out of Rome, right? whatever your exact take on it, it's not of the divine origin. It's coming from something other than God. Why does it have horns of a lamb and speak like a dragon? You guys remember what we talked about with that? Kind of similar to the locusts. If you remember the description of the locusts, they had hair, like beautiful hair, like a woman, but they had tails that stung, beautiful but dangerous. So what's happening here when you have the horns of a lamb and speak like a dragon?
Lambs are cute and cuddly.
Yeah.
You trust them.
Appears to be something innocent, right? But it isn't. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So how does this beast make the earth, which, once again, what's the earth? Unbelievers. How does it make the earth worship the first beast? Because that's what's happening here, right? It forces the worship of the first beast.
By performing great signs, it's empty promises.
Right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and make sure that we said the first beast is political and military Rome. Second beast is religious Rome. So how does the second beast force worship of the first beast? Well, they do signs, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that are meant to mislead people. But also, what was happening? We talked about the religious cults that were emphasizing, of course, they were pagan, and they were emphasizing worship of Rome as an empire, and also the emperor of Rome. And some of the emperors, like we talked about, some didn't want to be worshipped in that way, and were good. And, I mean, to a certain extent at least, right? Not good holy, but good. While others actually wanted to be worshipped as a deity and forced worship. It makes me think of the time, what happened with, back in Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar, he makes the image and forces people to bow down to the image, anytime music was played, or something like that, right? And they were to bow down to the image, and of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which it always cracks me up that we use that name, I guess it's because they're easier to say, because what was it, Mishael and Azazel, or whatever, the three Jewish names, but these are their names, Babylonian names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're thrown into the fire because they wouldn't bow down to the image. They were to be killed. Same deal going on here, right? If you don't accept the Roman religion, if you don't accept the emperor, you could be killed. And what was happening to Christians at this time?
Being killed.
A lot of them were being killed, right?
Well, and it's the economic hardship that's placed on you. If you don't do this, then you can't sell goods. You can't.
That's what if you didn't have the mark of the beast, which once again not a literal mark, but if you didn't worship and do what you were told, you were singled out. Now, how did they do that without an actual physical mark? I mean, do people?
Hard to figure out.
Yeah. Do people get singled out today? Do we live in cancel culture? I mean, think about it. It's not that hard to tell. So, not only were some killed physically in terrible ways, but also economically they were persecuted by just not being allowed to do ordinary business. And I kind of just already talked about this, but what was the mark that's put on people's forehead? We talked about how, back in the previous chapter, there was the mark put on Christians' foreheads, which isn't a literal mark, but it's a mark from God. And here, you would have the same kind of thing. So the economic problems that Christians would have if they refused to be a part of these cults or this worship is being emphasized here. Now then, Hines adds that there may be some physical marker that was given for certain false religions. So there could be some kind of an actual sign that could be being referred to here. I don't know about that. It doesn't really matter. The gist of what's being said, we get, right? If you don't worship, if you're a Christian and you're not willing to worship the way that Rome's telling you to, there's going to be problems for you. And so that's what these beasts represent. Now, another interesting part that we talked about, 666, right? People get into the number of 666. What person does this represent? Now, we talked about how 6 has an evil, sinister meaning because 7 represents perfection, 6 falls short of 7. What's that joke? 7, something was afraid of something because 7, 8, 9, whatever, however that works. Yeah, 10 was afraid or whatever. Anyway, but it falls short of 7, so 666 would seem to indicate that this false religion, once again, assuming that you agree that we're talking about the religion of Rome, it comes from people and not God. It would be applicable to any man-made religion. So it may, going back to that lamb, but speaks like a dragon, it may have the appearance of something good, but it falls short. Even if it actually is good, there are religions that do good out there, but don't do what God wants them to do, and it falls short, and that's a problem. Only God can save us. We can only be saved through God's plan. So it's very important that we seek out what God's will is, not necessarily the appearance of religion or the appearance of what's good, but that we actually make an effort. I think it's important enough for us to make an effort and to actually find out what we need to do. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people kind of fall in that, I'm a good person, I try to do what God wants me to do, and they don't ever seek any further than that. I think eternity is important enough that we really should be focused on that and really try to teach people it's important for us to get people to want to seek it out for themselves. Like this is the only thing that can help. Even our interpretation of it isn't necessarily what somebody needs. Okay, so 13, chapter 13, that's, I think, really, to me, it comes down to something pretty simple. A lot of people have different thinking on it, but when you connect 13 to 17, which is clearly meant to be done, and it talks about, and you get the 7 hills, and this is Rome, and then you get the 2 different parts of Rome, and the false religion and the persecution that was going on, seems to make sense to me. Like I don't see that there's should be a lot of confusion about what is being described in chapter 13. But as I said, that's my opinion, and some people have differences there. But it's certainly pretty frightening. So as a Christian in that time period, seeing that these beasts are gonna continue to persecute Christians, you'd be ready to hear about something good, right? And that's why in Revelation we keep going back and forth between these warnings of what's coming, the judgments that God's gonna deal out, and then also we go back and we see these scenes in heaven where God's in control, the saints are worshiping him, and those kind of things. And so next week when we get into chapter 14, that's where we've seen these frightening images in 13. Now we're going to get back into something that's going to encourage us and tell us that God's still in control. Now chapter 14 is has some pretty tough stuff that you can go down interpretation wise as well. But I think the theme of 14 and 15 is God's in control, and these things are coming from God, and if we stay faithful to God, everything's going to be okay. Even if it's not okay here, we're secure, our souls are secure. All right, anybody have any final comments on these beasts before we leave them and start there next week? All right, then we'll be back in about 15 minutes for worship, and then we'll pick up there next week.